Good evening and welcome to the Town of Chesapeake Beach's Planning and Zoning Commission meeting of May 24th, 2023. I'd like to call this meeting to order, please, and we'll have roll call. Madam Clerk, please note that all the commissioners are here except for Commissioner Brown. And number two, we're going to have the approval of the May 24th, 2023 Planning and Zoning agenda. And if I could, I would like to actually amend the agenda to add let's see here, we have number 6. Let's add it before we go to comments by commissioner. So let's make it 6A. Let's make it 6A or 6B. We'll have to make it 6B, I guess, because we've already got number 6. And it's going to be Mr. Jakubiak discussing an item for next month's agenda. That I would like him to introduce for tonight. Okay, do I have any other any additions to the agenda tonight or deletions? Okay, I would like to move with the amendment or the amended change. I would like to move the approval of the agenda for tonight's meeting. Do I hear any objections? No? Okay, all in favor? Aye. All opposed? Okay, let's approve the agenda. Number 3, approval of the minutes for the April 26, 2023 Planning and Zoning meeting.
I vote to approve the minutes.
Questions, concerns? Okay, all in favor of approving? Aye.
Aye.
I don't have a second.
Oh, I'm sorry, any seconds on
I'll
that?
second it.
Sorry, we have a second. We have a second. We always have a second in Miss Commissioner Rutke, so it's always a given. Always a given on the seconds.
Look at
Okay.
I'll second it.
So again, we all are in favor of approving the minutes. Number 4, we are going to offer up some new dates for our November and December meeting, and then also have a recess in August because the town council always has a recess in August. Does anybody have any issues with 1, 2, or 3 making those changes? And of course, I know you may have some issues with your travel plans there, Commissioner Hahn. But if there are no concerns about those dates, would somebody like to move this agenda item?
Can you just give me a minute so I can, okay, November 22nd is going to a week before.
That's on a Wednesday.
Yep. And I just want to check December. That's a good move for the December 27th.
How you doing on that? Okay?
Yep.
Okay. Do I hear a motion to approve?
I make a motion to approve.
I have a second.
Second.
Oh, I'll second.
I was waiting for you to second it.
I know
Okay,
you
all
were.
in favor of making the
Aye.
changes? Aye. Okay, that has moved. Okay, number 5. I'm looking in the audience. I see nobody to make a comment, so we will return it back to number 6. Critical area regulations, Mr. Jakubiak.
Okay. Last meeting, we concluded with outlining some homework for the commissioners, namely to review specifically to review the buffer and the buffer exempt area regulations, what we're calling now the modified buffer regulations, but the buffer exempt regulations in the current zoning ordinance, and read the model ordinance and how it addresses the buffer and the modified buffer. And you probably noticed that there was some big differences between the two. And that's okay. It allows, the state does allow the various jurisdictions in the critical area to modify the model ordinance to come up with things that are different, but they just have to be reviewed and approved by the Critical Area Commission. And by that, I mean the formal commission of the state. And they get a recommendation from their staff. They hold a public hearing in Annapolis, and they review or deny changes. About 15 years ago, I think it was, the town suggested a number of changes to the buffer exempt regulations, because before then they looked a lot like the standard model, but they went to the Crook Area Commission. I was working with the town at the time, and I provided some technical support to the town attorney, and they changed the buffer regulations. The Crook Area Commission changed the buffer regulations for Chesapeake Beach, and they effectively created an approach whereby someone who's building within the 100 feet buffer, 100 feet from the water, could do their mitigation for the impacts by establishing a buffer yard or a green space that would collect stormwater and treat it. And usually that would also contain plants. The plants generally are for the benefit of the environment, but they also are for aesthetics and general landscaping. But the important thing is the way that the land filters the water and how it conveys, water is conveyed to it and treated before it's discharged to the bay. And after, I remember this, after many, many months of back and forth between the town and the Critical Area Commission, they ultimately approved the town's regulations. They modified them and then approved them. So if you, for instance, have had an opportunity to go to the rod and reel site that's still, in some level of construction, but if you walk along the fishing creek where the boats are pulled in, between the parking garage and the water, you'll see what looks like a kind of a sunken green space. And there's plants planted. There's they're really essentially 15-foot wide planters. And they run the length of the frontage on the water, not the entire length, because the way the ordinance is required or is dressed, you don't have to do it the entire length. But they're there, and that is a way that the project met the critical area standards. So they followed that standard. You might also remember that Abner's Restaurant added a game room. They called it the Game Room Edition. You might remember that. It was 5 years ago, maybe more. And the Planning Commission required a rearrangement of the parking area. They took a building down, old house, and built a new parking area. And as a condition for the additional impervious or asphalt parking area, they had to do a buffer yard. And it's a 15-foot strip of green space nature, essentially, between the parking area and the water. And that's been in place for some time now at various levels of compliance, I must say, to be candid. But the town has been on it, and there's a couple of trees planted in there now, and it's green and grows up with natural vegetation. It doesn't look quite nice, but it satisfies the environmental element of it. So there are two examples of how that 15-foot buffer yard was established. So the question is, moving forward, do we want to keep that, quote, innovation, that the town structured to support redevelopment in the waterfront area, or fall back to the less specific approach that's set forth in the model ordinance, which really doesn't say exactly how you do it. In fact, I need to kind of look back at that too, because right now I can't think exactly what it says, but it's more, it's less prescriptive than what the town ultimately adopted. So your predecessors here in the Planning Commission about, like I said, 15 years ago, went through the same discussion. And I don't know if I was actually here during those times, but they ultimately decided to recommend the changes, and they sent them up to the Critical Area Commission, and they were approved. So there are other aspects of this for the modified buffer, but that's the biggest kind of change. And there's only limited parts of this that we can actually change. We can't say the buffer doesn't matter. We can't say we're going to do whatever we want. We can't say we're going to put buildings up closer to the water than they are now. No, can't do that. So um, well, we ended the last meeting with the sense that you were going to take some time to review it. And if you have any questions or if you want to explore any thoughts you had, now would be a good time to do that. And I can answer any questions or try anyway.
Okay, let's go with some questions here. Commissioner Rutke, would you like to start with some questions?
A comment, and that is that I would rather prefer something a little more detailed than open-ended, because I think could get in a row with somebody about what we thought and they thought and couldn't agree. So I prefer the current way rather than going back to a more open, way.
Okay, no other questions then, just comment. Commissioner Hahn?
No questions at this time.
Commissioner Blackwelder?
So I do have a couple questions. It says here on our current code that development or redevelopment in a buffer exemption area shall be subject to all the criteria applicable to the underlying zoning district and shall be further subject to all the criteria applicable to the governing land use classification. So that was what our current code was. And so my question is, on the rod and reel development, where is 20% open space? And my question, I guess that matters less than going forward. We have, mostly redevelopment in the maritime zone. Will they have to meet the requirements of the zoning district as far as open space goes?
So the open space applies to new development moving forward, the 20% open space? Or are you referring to the standard in the dimensional requirements require open space on lots?
Well, kind of both, because what this excerpt says is that we should have required open space on the rod and reel property.
Yes.
I don't know that there's 20%, but maybe there is, but.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'm thinking is, did we increase that, or did you increase that from 15% to 20% when we went through this rezoning?
No,
Or
we
was that
kept
number-
it the same.
Okay, kept that
Somebody
the same.
tried to reduce
Yeah.
it, but we kept it the same.
Yeah, so I do know that when we went through the site plan review process, the planning commission asked about the compliance with all the landscaping requirements, and they all checked positive. They meet that 20% standard, and they do it in part through counting the buffer yards as part of their landscaping. But there's also landscaping around the perimeter up closer to the bridge, then on the backside and in the parking areas, I guess on all sides of the building. But so moving forward, yes, every project would have to comply with their open space requirements. And the critical area regulations, no matter how we structure them, wouldn't relieve someone of that burden unless you specifically wanted to make it tougher. You could do that, but I think the way that any project would proceed would be to comply with the various standards for landscaping, whatever, in this general code, and then comply with the additional standards in the critical area section. So that's not changing.
Yeah, as I was going through this, I marked a lot of stuff up, and I don't need to highlight every single place I marked, but it was, question, did this happen? And I just going for, can't do anything about what's built, it's built, you can't unbuild it. But going forward, I'd like to make sure that we at least comply with the code that's written. And then my other question, well, I have many questions as usual. I have one question about the shorelines. So there's tidal wetlands and then there's the bay shoreline. And do they each incur the 75% buffer yard how are we going to address that for, I mean, maybe the Rod and Rail is the only property that has both that might be developed. So I guess my question would be, anything on the corner of a tidal wetlands is each,
Yeah, so wherever there is a buffer exempt area, and that would be along the bay as well as Fishing Creek or along wetlands, there you have to do a buffer yard, and you only have to do it up to 75%. So yes, it would apply irrespective of where it's located, bayside or not. Not only that, you can put walkways through the buffer yard to provide access to the water. And that is a real nod to this notion that we have kind of a maritime type of area where you got to get to your boats or get to the pier that runs parallel to the bay. So that's why you're able to, that's why it's reduced to 75% to allow these cut throughs.
so there's the maritime zone, which is one area, and I think that's already impervious. It's already got things going on. But we have 2 habitat protected parcels. And I think that the model ordinance makes buffer requirements stronger for those areas. And so I'm not prepared to, motion and figure this out now. I'm hoping for your expertise of how to better protect those areas. And I'm assuming for the FIDs, until I hear otherwise, I think we've put that property at risk. And so with everything we do, I'm looking to try to protect it more because unless the town gets a lawyer and gets that turned over, that property is at risk as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. So the FIDS area that you're referring to is buffer, but it's also but it's not buffer exempt. It's buffer. So that means these rules that apply to modified buffer in the model don't apply. That you have to, where there's pure natural buffer, you have to maintain that. So these modified buffers and discussion of buffer yards and pathways to the water don't apply to the buffer. They don't apply to that FIDS area. So there's that, meaning that that area is protected by that. In other words, the critical area regulations are drawn to protect the most natural areas to the highest extent possible. And that's why the buffer, the FIDS area is shown as RCA. So you have the RCA designation, which is the most restrictive with respect to any kind of development activities, plus the designation of buffer along the water's edge. So there, the state's protection is the greatest. So I just want to make sure there's no confusion about that. That same level of protection does not apply to the bayfront where houses front the bay or to here in the marina.
And so last meeting, we said RCA, no development. There's 2 lots that are, well, there's a couple lots that are in what we said RCA that are labeled residential. So if they're labeled residential and we say no housing, or if they are in the RCA, but they are zoned in a residential district, like there's 2 on the market right now that are like that. What does that mean? What have we done? And it seems like we're creating a mess for ourselves.
So you're saying that there are some instances where there are houses that exist within the critical areas RCA zone, not within the town's RC zone,
Right.
but within the most restrictive critical area zone. Okay. They can continue to exist, but they can't be changed to anything more intensive, those houses. And there's that, but that's a discussion separate from the buffer, right?
Okay.
I just want to make that distinction. We're not talking about the buffer now. We're talking about the general RCA standards. Even our town's zoning ordinance would allow a single-family house to continue wherever it was.
What if it was a vacant lot?
No, a vacant lot in the RC zone will be a vacant lot
Okay.
unless it's put to one of those 3 or 4 or 5 uses that the town expressly allowed in the
What
RC.
about a vacant lot in the RV zone?
Vacant lot in RV can develop with a house.
Any of
If
them?
it's no, not anyone. If it's a legal lot of record.
But if it is in the RC, because we have some vacant lots in the RV zone that are in the critical area. We have some that are zoned IDA, and we have some that are not, that are in the critical area, but not zoned IDA or LDA. They're hanging out on Elm Street.
Are you certain that they're zoned RCA?
Well, no, I'm not, because I haven't seen a map.
There are a lot of wooded, small little lots on Elm Street and on that kind of hillside there where it's all forested. And remember, the first zoning map we presented showed that area as RC. But we had people come in and say, I've owned these lots forever. And the planning commission, remember, I actually redrew the boundary for you. We went back and forth. And you changed that back to RV. Those areas are IDA. So they're red on the zoning, on the critical area map. However, you have to have the minimum lot area. So you have to consolidate some of those parcels to make them developable. You also have to have access to a public street, which means in some cases, somebody would have to build a street to access them. So there are a lot of complications, or else you would have imagined a lot of those lots would have been built.
Right, so assuming no complications, they could get built.
Assuming no lot complications, they all have frontage and they met the minimum lot requirements, lots could be built. And they're in a critical area, so they would have to meet the critical area stormwater management regulations, which is not exceedingly difficult, but it does involve creating on-site means for collecting water, purifying it before they release it, before it gets released to the storm drain system and out to the water. In other words, they would be treated just like a vacant lot in any of the existing subdivisions. Where you can actually build a house. It just so happens that a lot of these lots are wooded. But I should mention that the town council passed a code revision a couple years ago concerning steep slopes, construction on steep slopes. A lot of those areas are steeply sloped. And by that I mean the grade is greater than 15%, which is steep, but it's not as if it's something that like a cliff. But in order to go through the building process on a house with a steep slope, you've got to have a geotechnical analysis and other additional environmental standards have to be met to make sure that any construction on the slope would not be impactful to the area, would not cause the slope to fail or excessive erosion or other issues. So there's that, and we've used that mechanism on properties other than just on B Street.
And then if I remember correctly, for a slope, the buffer gets bigger. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would that
Mhm.
apply there as well? Or not, because
I
it's,
don't know so much there. I don't know that we have much in the way of buffer there. It's somewhat removed from
Right, it's
actual
across the
open
road.
water or
Yep.
tidal wetlands. So I don't think it's relevant.
I have a lot of questions, so I might just have to ask
Go ahead.
some other time, like while we're going through this.
You're talking about the buffer. We're talking about the buffer.
I know, and it seems like I'm jumbling them, so maybe I'll ask my specific questions as we go along rather than,
Well, do you want to start at page, could we start at page 17 of our version 2022? Would you like to start on page 17 where it's the buffer and then go through? Because it's obviously the question about the buffer, correct? And then, of course, modified buffer is right after that. But I think we need to, the buffer area to me is very important. And I think we need to really get our questions and get our ideas down here precisely. So what kind of questions do you have on section A? Do you have any questions on section A? Let's just go through section A. Anybody have any questions on section A? Let's just not randomly scatter around here.
so I highlighted the word all in section A.
So apply
to
all
apply
of the
all of
required.
the required standards. And so, I'm assuming this is one that is stronger than our current code. So I just noted that. And for the buffers, I would like to choose the stronger code for those areas. I think there's a difference in, there's a big difference in the proposed tree ordinance in a lot of these mitigation requirements, and the state's requirements are stronger. I would prefer the state's over most things I saw in the tree ordinance proposal.
I can explain why that's different. But
Okay.
when I get to that,
Yeah, there was lots of differences.
the tree ordinance actually,
And,
Okay, well, that's at a different section.
well, this all deals with that. It deals with replacement of trees. It deals
Well,
with.
I'll tell you what, let's still stay on A. Does anybody else have any questions on A on page 17, 18? Anybody
I
have
do.
questions? Let's go ahead and let's just clean up that A area. Go ahead, Commissioner.
My question is, 15 years ago, you said that these regulations were made. Is that right, Chris?
what I said was that the town's critical area regulations were modified 15 years ago.
To include the buffer?
No. The buffer and the buffer exempt area was already established because that was state law. That was the model back then. And the town tweaked it by going to the Board of Appeals, going to the Critical Area Commission and got approval to tweak it. And their changes were limited to the buffer exempt area, just the urban parts of the buffer, not the naturalized area. It was just, as a way of addressing redevelopment within essentially the marina areas and any areas that were already developed.
My question is, any of these changes inherent in that were not based on environmental concerns, or were they? Because I think it's just imperative for us now, especially when we talk about the buffer, that our regs are stricter, because the whole topography is different today, because of the rising water levels, because of the, ecosphere. And I think we have to really look at this in context of that. And my question is, previously, was it done with such focus in that area? But, climate, as we all know, has now, it's just significant in everything. And it's so impactful that I think we have to be very mindful of that in deciding and making, regulations regarding this.
So they were made with respect to the environment in mind, those modifications. And of course, they were approved by the Critical Area Commission, and that's their mission, is to protect water quality and wildlife habitat within the critical area. They wouldn't have been approved if that were not the case. It was just a different way of meeting the requirements. And but moving forward, I couldn't agree with you more. And candidly, that's what gives me pause about a lot of these standards, but more so is how they're applied. So if we're just talking about the waterfront where development is now, and when you think about that, it's mostly Fishing Creek, where it's all asphalt up to the water's edge. You might remember the town received a application a number of years ago for I think it was a 5-story apartment building or condominium building on Gordon Stanton Boulevard. It's right on the water. So if you go right down the street, make a right, and you pass the little road that leads to the water park, there you get to a little parking lot that's on the left. On the right is Kelman's Field, and there's a parking lot for boats. Right on the right, there's a parking lot for boats or cars, but it's small. It's butts up next to the water. It's an area that's often underwater when we have high tide events. Right. Continue on, you get to the Fishing Creek Apartments. There was a proposal, and when it came in, I said, timeout, we need to get the staff together. We need an engineering review. We need a lot of things before we can even advise the Planning Commission about. In fact, I don't think anybody here, even Cindy, I don't think you were on the commission at the time. And we had a technical meeting of folks to meet with the developer and the developer's engineers. And I said, I have grave concern about what you're proposing, because you're proposing to mitigate for your impact. And there is mitigation that's required all through it. Mitigation means you got to make up for the impact that you're having on the environment. You're proposing to put mitigation at ground level, which will be swamped by the typical flood and by sea level rise. And of course, the response was, yes, well, we'll raise the seawall, which will protect, water overcome. Yes, but still, there's water gets around it, and we're in a very compromising environment over there. And I said, anything that you do that you're proposing here is going to be flooded. And why would the town allow you to mitigate for your impacts in an area that's going to be underwater? And of course, the developer's response was, which is a legal response. The developer's attorney said, we only have to comply with the law that exists today. And that didn't sit well with me. And as it turned out, the project never really left that office. It's still in there. It never came to you because they struggled with how they could actually meet that. And then over the course of time, you might remember the zoning ordinance was changed and the project never went forward. But they got hung up on that technical issue for quite some time. But it was a valid response. It was about applying the ordinance in a way. And it was hard to, it's hard to write that standard, Kathy. I don't know how to write that standard yet. And everybody at the state is trying to figure this out. We've got this MDE, DNR, Critical Area Commission, and much more of the sophisticated urban counties are all are struggling with this issue because they don't want to prevent someone from building seawalls that are going to protect the area. But they don't want to require mitigation that is going to be underwater. And they want to make sure buildings are built that are above, the elevated. And then how do you do plantings and all these? It's very complicated. And you can't, it changes the whole way we do stormwater management because the stormwater management systems get flooded. They can't discharge if the water is above. They just backed up because there's head pressure. So these things are not figured out yet. And so you might remember in the comprehensive plan, I kind of wrote a little treatise on this. I mean, it sort of permeates all this discussion of, we've got to come up with new regulations. We need time to figure this out. And I don't think the regulatory bodies in the state know what the answer is yet, and I don't know either. But it might be worthwhile to have something in here that says the application of these standards shall take into consideration sea level rise and projected increases, over the next, through the year 2050, because that number of 2.4 feet sea level rise is the consensus among the scientists that say this is the number that's reasonably expected to be, and we anticipate it's the best number to use for planning purposes. I think it's a legitimate number that we can attach a regulation to. So if we just cite that, then the challenge is on the designers and on the planners and on you to look at a project and say, well, am I satisfied as a decision maker that this mitigation and stormwater solution is designed to meet that threshold? And you'll hear testimony from the developer's attorney and or developer's engineers and from the town's engineer, and you can make a decision. I think that's the best we can do right now. But at some point, there's going to be a whole new regime of regulations that the state's working on. Actually, they're interviewing people now. They're kind of scrambling to figure this out.
So, one of the ways that you talked about was just less building in certain areas like that. And I think I heard something in the town council meeting that I didn't like too much. It was a revisiting of those condos, and those condos at that density don't fit for mitigation, and they don't fit for a lot of other reasons. So I wish that somebody would stop saying that we are going to eventually approve those condos because they
Which
don't
condos?
fit.
Are you talking
and they
about
can't be
townhomes?
mitigated.
Are you talking about townhomes or condos?
I'm talking about the condos in the town center. Yeah. And I know they're zoned out right now.
Right.
But just like they're zoned out, they can be zoned right back in. And apparently the infrastructure that's going there can support all of them. But they are not a smart thing to put there. So I wish that people would stop talking about them as if they are still going to occur, because that is preventing a better plan from coming about.
Wasn't there, so I don't have any comments on that. I'm not sure what that's all about.
It was at the 56-minute mark.
Make note of
There
that.
you go.
It might have been 57.
All right, let's go back to Commissioner Brault. She was questioning or having some questions here about something in A. Anything else did you get your question answered, by the way, Commissioner Brault?
Yes, I did.
Okay, anything else in A? I'm still on A because there's something I want to ask in A. It was on page 18. Let me go ahead and I'll ask my question. It's just, when you go to 2A, they talk about intra-family transfer subdivision. What is that?
Imagine a farmer that owns a large swath of land along the water and wants to build a house for one of the kids and transfer the lot and actually create a legal lot of record and transfer it to one of the children. The critical area laws kind of carve out a number of exceptions for that type of situation. And that's what this is about. That really it just doesn't work for us. It's not a relevant.
Doesn't make,
standard.
no, it doesn't make, no, it seems irrelevant to our needs here, but then I can't think of all the instances that we might have something. I think when I look at like B, if you go to 2B, they talk about the sewage reserve area. The reduced buffer should be the minimum necessary to accommodate a dwelling and a sewage reserve area, but no less than 100 feet. That to me doesn't seem relevant either, because we well,
Where are you, Cindy?
I'm sorry, I'm page
Page
18,
18.
2B, or 2A and B is what I was going on. Um,
You want me to explain what that,
yeah, if you could
Yes.
explain that one, it just.
yeah.
Okay.
Again, and remember, this is state law, so it's gone through a lot of compromises to reflect various interests in the
Yeah,
state
right.
before it makes its way to us. And this is the model. So if that farmer again, or that large landholder carves out a lot for that child, by the way, it has to be permitted under the municipal or the county zoning ordinance first. Because if the town's zoning ordinance doesn't allow for a residential lot to be created, then there's no dice. You can't go any further. But if theoretically our ordinance allowed for housing in RC area in a buffer, you could transfer a lot, create a lot, and transfer. It means sell it to your family member. And it would go as interfamily transfer, meaning it has to stay connected to the original land holding. You can't then just sell it to the next guy on the street. It has to sort of remain in that family holding. But it's basically saying that rather than being 200 feet from the water's edge, it can be closer to the water's edge than it could be, but can't be any closer to 100 feet. The reduced buffer shall be the minimum necessary to accommodate the dwelling and the sewage reserved area, which is the septic field. So if the lay of the land was such that the house had to be on this flat surface here, and that meant that it was within 200 feet of the water, it's okay. And if it needed to be there in order to put the sewage treatment or the septic recovery field, somewhere close to the water, that's fine, as long as you have 100 feet distance. It just carves out an exception for these interfamily transfers. And these houses would be standalone houses, not connected to any municipal system, simply.
Well, would we have anything like that in this town without being connected to our sewage system? I mean, we wouldn't have anything
No.
in this town to be relevant, but do we need to keep it in our own plan if it's not relevant to us?
I don't want to keep it in our own plan. I think that's a question for the critical area. We were just talking, I think that's the question. We'd like to remove this. Are you okay with that? Because it's not relevant to Chesapeake
Right, it's
Beach.
not relevant, so I
Can't
think
build a house
you
in
don't want
Chesapeake Beach
to have all
anymore
this
without-
superfluous stuff in here. So would the entire 2 go, or just 2B go? I'm a little concerned about this intrafamily transfer subdivision situation, because it just seems like that could run amok and you would lose track of who's really family and who's not. It just seems like a silly situation and not relevant again to our situation. But I guess the entire section 2 could go when I look at it, when I think about it. And I can't imagine why we ever would want to reduce it from 200 to 100 in any situation anyway. I just, when you have sea level rise and everything changing, as Commissioner Brault was saying, why would we ever want to consider this anyway?
You might want to just put a period after number 2 and delete A and B, the exceptions,
Okay, that's what I.
right?
so
Because
delete-
you don't want to eliminate the 200-foot buffer. And
But then it says, and 100 feet from a tributary stream. But see, to me, in our area, our tributaries are very vital, very important to the Chesapeake because we're so close to the Chesapeake. I wouldn't think we'd want anything 200 feet close to even our tributaries, which would be considered Fishing Creek, correct?
as a practical matter, I mean, it seems relevant that it's a tributary stream, but it may be classified as a tidal wetland, just the way this is an estuary here. It's not so much the stream, but a fair point and something to inquire about, in which case you would say 200 feet from tidal waters or tributary stream. The reality is that you can make standards tougher than the Critical Area Commission has drafted.
So we could delete the 100 feet from a tributary stream and just have at least 200 feet from a tidal waterway or tidal wetlands and tributary streams. I mean, we could just say it that way and eliminate that. Because I really believe that 100 feet today is going to be 50 feet tomorrow. I mean, it's just a matter of time, but I think we've just got to keep that number as high as we can go, which 200 feet is even close in my estimation, but
So 200 feet from a tidal waterway, comma, delete the word or, tidal wetlands, comma, and tributary stream. Or street, probably or is the right word, I guess. Or tributary stream. So it's tidal waterway, wetlands, or stream.
Excuse me, I have a question.
yes, please.
So Fishing Creek, when the developer develops in Richfield Station, and if I recall, they have to put a bridge in or something like that to develop, and then that 40, I think it's 40 houses that he's building, that is towards Fishing Creek. So is there any way that that development could possibly impact Fishing Creek or be related to this area that we're discussing?
Are you referring to the stream walkway section?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, that would require a bridge to access those lots.
I mean, if I remember correctly, those lots, I don't know how close they come to Fishing Creek, but that's all I can think about with this. And how would that affect that?
Yeah, I think they're kind of, this subdivision went through a process called growth allocation where it was able to, its areas that were critical area were able to lift the critical area standards and develop at essentially as if it weren't critical area. And I think that approach applies to this. So it's kind of exempt from the strict critical area regulations.
Right, but it was never filed. It was never filed. I mean, those lots would have to be reviewed again against the entire RPC.
Yeah, I don't know, Lori. We could look in that. I mean, that's a little more detail than I was prepared to talk about tonight. I
Right.
just don't. But I know that those are platted lots. So the kind of legal lots of record that could be built, houses could be built. And if there were critical area lots, each lot would have to do a separate stormwater management kind of approach. Just like any lot here in the middle subdivision across the street would have to do a rain garden or something like that. These regulations don't prevent those houses from being built or that bridge from being constructed.
I'm just concerned looking at this. I mean, realistically, when they were plotting it 20, 25 years ago, longer, we didn't know about climate change. We didn't realize the impact that it's going to have. So I'm just concerned about the potential that it could be more detrimental
Mhm,
than when we originally looked at
Right.
everything and approved it.
Right. Yeah.
Did I hear you say that critical area restrictions were removed from that parcel? Did I hear you correctly or am I?
Yeah, and there was a kind of a lazy way of answering the question. They've gone through what's called a growth allocation process. It's a process whereby the land's critical area designation is changed from a more restrictive portion to a less restrictive. So if that area, and I just don't know for a fact, but if that area were considered LDA or RCA, the more restrictive part of the critical area, the growth allocation would have allowed it to be IDA, much like most of the critical area in town, like where it's developed already. So it basically allows for development. That process was used in other sections of town as well. In fact, at some point, we're going to talk about the growth allocation parts of this code in the later sections. We get to there, I can talk a little bit about the growth allocation because it's really kind of complicated, but it's basically the way of upzoning land within the critical area to make it so that it can be developed.
So if the restrictions were removed, was there anything that was put in place to offset the restrictions in some other form or fashion to help offset that restriction being removed?
Yeah, and we talk a lot about the FIDS habitat and that 200 acres. Yeah, was part of that whole discussion of allowing development in some area while preserving this forest perpetually. through
Okay,
it.
so if I understand, we removed the critical restrictions from that area and in exchange, we received the FIDs for the other area?
Yeah, essentially.
I don't know that that's entirely correct. I think the whole RPC came in first and it had open space. And then part of the RPC was developed at a higher density because it was supposed to have a certain density.
Mhm.
And then another portion of Richfield Station was developed at a higher density, and that area was subject to the FIDS. The Streamwalk Way area was never filed, and I have no idea what that's associated with because this board has never seen an entire RPC subdivision assessment, which is required to change any land use in the FIDS. So I don't know where we stand with that now, but that's what needs to happen. So when we review site plans in the RPC, it is going to be very complicated.
Any further questions? To my right, nothing down on this side on questions for A. We're still on A. Okay, let me go back to A1 then. So a buffer of at least 100 feet is delineated and expanded as described in A3 based on existing field conditions, et cetera. And then they go to the 200 feet minimum. I'm just wondering why we don't use the 200 feet minimum in 1 when the buffer should be at least 200 feet. It seems like that would be in line with number 2. Start out with number 1 having 100 feet. Shouldn't it all be the same amount of footage?
Well, 2 applies for new development. It's basically saying where there's new development, new subdivision, development activities, you've got to meet a higher standard than what would exist generally.
Right, but I don't understand why it wouldn't apply to any, the buffer of 100 feet. It would seem like you're worried about development there as well. It would seem to me that you would want to indicate the buffer should be 200 feet, and then that would make it a lot easier in applying any kind of.
Within the buffer, and again, I want to make it clear, we're not talking about the buffer, the modified buffer.
Right, we're not talking about the modified.
talking about-
We're still on the buffer here.
And the buffer that we have in town is is along the panhandle, natural part of the panhandle that extends down to the southern edge of town. So it's roughly from Brownies Beach down. I don't know where the actual line begins, but the other part is on Fishing Creek, where Fishing Creek and the wetlands kind of merge together, and then you get to upland areas. So those are tidal wetlands, so the land that touches them are considered buffer. And the current standard there is 100-foot buffer. You're suggesting that in basically on page 17, we say that a buffer of 200 feet is delineated, period. That you start with 200 feet rather than 100 feet.
What is the consequence of changing it to 200? Well, I'm just talking out loud
Yeah,
here.
that's what I'm thinking through too.
Yeah, is a 100-foot buffer in concert with state or other stricter regulations? I mean, it seems to me they didn't arbitrarily just pick 100.
Well, it was just a number that was,
They did arbitrarily pick one. Oh.
well, why not 98?
I stand corrected. Okay.
I will say that there's been a lot of science in this since the 1980s when this was adopted to look at stream or riparian buffers. And 100 feet is generally considered for a natural buffer to be generally protective of the water quality. You know, if it's pure meadow or forest, it's 100 feet. It's going to mean their stream is going to be much clearer.
Excuse me.
However, if you really want to protect the water quality and the wildlife habitat and really in the stream, you can go up to 300 feet or to the limits of the floodplain. You know, if the floodplain extends beyond, you want to kind of make that all natural, and that has the greatest protection of the water quality. So as it turns out, that number has some relevance, but it, you know, was adopted in 85. It seemed like the right number, and it was negotiated. This is a statewide political step in the direction of regulating within municipalities and counties that the state was involved in. So it was very complicated. The question is whether to, in Chesapeake Beach, make it larger. So let's look at what the standards are for what you can do in a buffer. So if you go to B, buffer development activities in the buffer.
Are you back on page 17?
Page 18 now.
18.
Oh, okay. Oh, B, a non-title?
No, the development
B.
activities in the buffer, page
On
18.
the very bottom, B, development.
Oh, I get it.
So these are, the list begins on 18 and goes to 19. These are things that are allowed within the buffer. So whether that's 100 feet or 200 feet, it's immaterial. These are things that the state is judged to be generally acceptable. Look at number 3. A development activity approved in accordance with the variance provisions of this ordinance. That means that under the way the ordinance is structured now, if you happen to do any development activity, you have to get a variance. You got to go through this Board of Appeals process. You got to go to the state. It's really kind of complicated. But that only applies if you're within 100 feet of the water. If you adopt a 200, then if you're in 200 feet of the water, now your project's going to this variance process. You see, so that's one implication. That means if you want to do any kind of development activity, and you got a lot more likelihood of having to go through the variance process. You don't have to preserve just your area, your regulated area is not just 100 feet. It's a wider band of 200 feet.
How come this reads like to me, a soup sandwich? I'm like, I'm like, I know this is English and I'm reading it and I'm like, what?
I've never heard
I mean, it's very convoluted. I mean, what they're trying to say.
What any particular section you?
3. I mean,
All those. the things in
B3 is like, I understand what you just interpreted that, but you know, if I was reading this, I'd be like, I don't understand it.
Well, it basically says if you get a, maybe it should say if you have a development in mind, you have to get a within the buffer. You can only get it approved if you through the variance provisions.
Well,
And
so,
only that type of project is exempt from the buffer regulations.
so our comprehensive plan says that our resource conservation lands essentially serve as buffer and recreation for the town. So in our resource conservation areas, essentially you're saying are the buffer. So do we have to allow 3 at all?
Well, I think so. It may be just theoretically. Think about the Fitz habitat again. Imagine that the town takes ownership of that someday and wants to build a pavilion to keep school kids in the shade when they go out to do a class trip to do water quality testing or whatever the kids want to do. Part of the Oyster Cultivation Society. That project then is a regulated development activity. If it's 105 feet away from the water, under the green gold provision, it's going to be regulated there.
I like the
It's,
title.
yeah, it's because now it's within, if you increase it to 200, now that project is going to go through a higher level review. Or it won't be able to be built. I mean, essentially it's got to be, it's 200 feet. It's going to have to be set back further away from the water. So, I mean, that's the one practical implications where the major chunk of the buffer is tied up in this conservation easement. It really doesn't allow anything to happen there, but for some kind of municipal type of project or something that's approved by the critical area. So if you basically you've expanded your protection zone to 200 feet if you go Cindy's route. But so I think it's worthwhile keeping some of these in because maybe the town says, well, I'd like to get a variance from the critical area regs so that we can do this facility within the 200 feet.
Well,
No,
could you
she
make
make-
an exception,
Right, make an exception for the town.
the town's purview for their development? I'm concerned that, when you have something that is 200 is going to end up getting changed to 100 by some kind of variance, and there you're going, as some commercial activity, it's a fun zone on the, whatever we can't control.
That we can carve out an exception for public development activity. However, there with respect to the buffer. However, within the critical area generally, there is essentially a different level of approval. It's called a conditional approval. You might remember the school, the elementary school, was expanding into an RCA area because they had to carve out an area. We asked for a trail to bend through, and they had to take some trees down, and that required not a kind of a complicated approval through this, but it required a conditional approval or not a conditional approval, a conformity finding. So we had to show the critical area commission that element of the project conformed with the critical area, the town's critical area program, and had to complete a form and sign it. And it's certified that, and they had to look at all these documentation and maps and elevations and grading profiles and mitigation requirements. And they eventually approved it. But it was just for a little incursion into a natural area. I think it was an RC area there. I don't know that the same type of conformity approval exists for a buffer, but I can ask a question about that. In other words, essentially you're asking, can we exempt a town project?
I guess we all want, because our buffers that still exist did come under growth allocation, and they were at one time completely protected, but they've been broken out over the years. And now, they're not as protected. And so I think it's every bit of fair to make sure that those buffers don't get developed intensively or, the Randall Cliffs parcel is a habitat protected parcel. Right now, somebody, at one point put an LDA on it. Now says it's residential property. All these things. I know we said that resource conservation can have no building, but I think we've also said a lot of times that that's not true. So, these parcels became vulnerable for whatever reason, and we would like to put as much protection back on them as possible.
I think on balance, keeping the 200-foot or establishing a 200-foot buffer on Chesapeake Beach's critical area buffer makes some sense because it is the most sensitive parts of the environment. It doesn't need to be developed to satisfy any type of public objective. It's not like you would meet any kind of public need by developing on a tidal wetland or on a protected forest on the wetland or on a steep Randall Cliffs Natural Heritage Area. And those are our RCA buffers, So, and we don't have buffer, apart from that, we don't have any buffer. Everything else is developed buffer already. So why not? And 200 feet fits within the logic of the way the critical area regulations are drafted now.
You say we could go 3? Did you say we could go up to 300?
I didn't say that, but
5, why not 5?
I mean, whatever the max we
Speaking
can
of
do, I
arbitrary.
think we want to do, and I think it's only fair because those buffers were used for other development. Somebody already made their money in those buffers.
The one concern I have is that would impact B Street, wouldn't it? And the development up on top of B Street, because if you go past 200, then we're going to be really,
oh no. So that's a buffer. That's the
modified
buffer.
buffer. That's
Yeah.
the modified
Yeah,
buffer. Okay,
that'd be in the next section of the
that's
story.
right, that's modified, okay.
We're not talking.
We're still talking about the
right.
buffer, that's right. Okay, so, all right, so now you're talking, let's go from 2 to 3 is what you're saying.
What I'm saying is, I don't know what the legal answer is because again, our board doesn't have an attorney. But the intent of me, I'm not going to speak for everybody else, is that those buffers were already used for somebody to make profit on the areas that they were associated with. And whatever protections we can put on them to the max level is fair. And so that would be what I would communicate. I don't know what that is. I don't have the expertise and I don't have a lawyer to ask. We have Chris to ask, but I know it's complicated for him to come up with some
The
honest
lowly
spot
planner
answer.
can offer a response.
Exactly.
The lowly planner can offer a response.
Yes.
Slowly planner, I'm just saying,
I know my role.
if you can put the highest level of protection in front of us, we can say approved.
Listen, these standards are really good for jurisdictions that anticipate the development of their buffer. Some jurisdictions are growing and they anticipate some development of natural areas, conversion of natural area to development. So that's why these standards, that's not the case. We have a land use plan that I think is the envy of a lot of municipalities. The buffer and the resource areas are protected by zoning. In other words, it's the town policy not to develop in those areas. So not only that, the biggest chunk of the buffer seems to be that FID's habitat protection area too. So there's development potential is not part of the plan. So saying 200 feet or 300 feet is fine. I mean, actually, but I wouldn't give up the exceptions because there may need to be a shoreline protection measure that needs to be built in a buffer. Or it might be in the town's interest to build a pier off of a buffer or to build a nature center for the kids close to the water. You don't want to prevent those things. So I think having some of these exceptions is important, but why not make it longer? I mean, I don't know what the right answer is, candidly, but 300 feet, as I mentioned before, is a standard that applies to riparian buffers. By that I mean streams, to provide them optimum protection, permanent protection. And when you can achieve that in a bigger development scenario, it's a real win for the environment because there's no stormwater, no wash off that's going to go into a stream. Everything that falls in that area is going into the ground, or it's going to make its way to the stream through a natural process of groundwater cleansing and all that. No erosion effects. So at this point, looking at this, I would say I'm not adverse to saying 300 feet. I don't think the implications are that significant as I'm looking at it now. Because again, this is not as if we anticipate a development scenario where we are promoting development. We realize we have to encroach into these natural areas. We've taken a different approach, which actually dates back many decades in the town that says this stuff, leave this alone. But now we have the zoning standards in place that protect it. So this is an added layer of protection along the band of the water. And it just so happens that that band in Chesapeake Beach is also zoned RCA. Even the panhandle, the part closest to the water, is green on the map. It's only kind of a narrow band within that panhandle that's yellow. This is IDA.
So are you saying we could change everything, all the footage from 100 and then we've got 200 on page 18? We could change all of that to 300?
No, I think so. I think so. I mean, again, this is something that I would run by the staff of the Critical Area Commission, but I think it's aligned with the town's development policy and its comprehensive plan and with the current zoning of land in the town. The implication, though, is that any public project that wants to improve those resources for kind of public recreation or access to the water will have to go through a more complicated review process. And it may be difficult. I don't know what the answer to that is. And even a town attorney wouldn't know the answer right now.
Right,
That's a
that's
complicated thing. And it's almost a case by case study, but I can give you an indication of how complicated it is. When I worked with the town to implement the vision for the railway trail that Bruce Wall and the previous mayor had conceptualized. And I remember working with the state, and they were really tough on getting that trail built. Not only the trail that was on the land, which was in the buffer, but the trail above the water as it crossed the wetlands. The town wanted 10 feet so you could bike safely past and you could walk and have more amenities. For Critical Area Commission said, no, we're not going to do that. You get 8 feet max, and that's the biggest that's necessary to accommodate two walkers and on a recreational trail. And we were flabbergasted because every trail you build now, you try to get 10 feet. Anyway, they said, no, you're impacting too much of the environment. And I remember walking through the forest, identifying the alignment with the critical area staff. And they were like, no, you're not going that direction. Too many trees there. You're gonna go. We walked down hills all the way down to the water. But that was development activity in the buffer, right? Because it went up to 100 foot and went right to the edge of the water, and they approved it. It was a public project and but it went through a very strident process. And the town was not given any breaks. There was all kinds of very expensive engineering that had to take place on the grades on either side of the trail and the mitigation and all the additional plantings the town had to do to mitigate for the trees that were removed within the buffer. And again, this RCA buffer, so it's very protective. The same thing would apply, except that it would apply now for a longer distance away from the water. But it still got built, right? The trail's there, and where there's public policy and the will to support something like that, it gets done. It just made the project more expensive as a practical matter. But on the other side, it helped secure the environmental health of the fishing creek in the bay. So
Well,
it maybe made it more enjoyable for people.
I just have an observation. I'm all for make it 500 feet. I mean, I'm all for making it more restrictive. But what concerns me is I don't want us to seem arbitrary. And you say, Chris, 300 would ensure and would safeguard these areas, the erosion, even in further out. So why, when we are Chesapeake Beach, and this is the treasure coast in Maryland, why wasn't this done previously? And what concerns me, and I've heard members from this commission voice that maybe the next Planning and Zoning Commission will look at this and say, who did that? Forget it. And so as I said, I'm happy to make it more restrictive, but I don't want us to seem arbitrary and just like, okay, I want us to make sure that this is based on facts, based on science. It's based on the true protection of right. Well, I just want to make sure that it's just what concerns me is that I don't want us to be looked at like we just pulled a number out of the air and said, oh, let's go. I want it to be so that we affect this. And then in the future, it's very obvious we're in Chesapeake Beach and we're trying to protect this treasure, which we're, to safeguard it.
So I can provide you documentation on buffer width in various environments. And there are a number of illustrations that document this that are produced by very scientific organizations in the state too. So, yeah, we can send some information to establish whether you decide 100 or 200 or 300. You'll have a basis for making the decision. It's great.
Or even if it's a footnote in our reg, that would be, that's fine for me. But I just, if we decide to change it to 300 and there's a footnote that says, current environmental science indicates that this wood is the typical footage to ensure, compliance with the, strict environmental, standards. That's fine with me if there's a footnote, but I just don't want it to look like, hey, let's pick this number.
Yeah. Make it the most strong that it can be with a case.
Reasonable and grounded
Yeah.
in some type of.
You had said earlier that
Well, it is a matter of fairness because we should have just kept it protected. I mean, if the FIDS gets developed,
right.
that is completely unfair to the entire community. Yeah. And Randall Cliffs was in the same situation many years back, just isn't anymore. Right now, the FIDS is current. That's the thing that we can get secured now. I don't know that we have that option with Randall Cliffs necessarily.
So going to now, if we're on B3, what did we decide about B3? Did we decide that that would be something that we could eliminate, delete? What are we thinking about number 3?
Rated in English?
Development or redevelopment activity approved in accordance with the variance provisions of this ordinance. So the variance provisions are,
Yeah, where are they?
where are they?
Well, I'm looking for it towards the end. That's almost there.
You put the lime in the coconut.
Let's see who finds it first.
Well, variances are page 39.
Here it is, 39. Ooh. The end of page
Cindy
39.
went. The chair.
I went to the table of contents.
Oh, I'm sorry. That discounts it.
I cheated.
Okay, so I won that.
Yeah, how come they don't put that page 39 when they're citing some other, ordinance?
Well, the interesting thing
Regulation.
is, unless we go to page 39, it could nullify everything that we are doing in part B if we're not careful on these variances. We have discovered that variances can change the entire conversation as to what's really going to be approved or not.
Everybody there?
Yes.
40, maybe it's best just to flip to page 40. So where the literal enforcement of the critical area regulations would result in unwarranted hardship to an applicant, a variance may be obtained. So let's just stay focused on the variance to the buffer provision. Okay, so someone would have to demonstrate items 1 and 2. First, you have to presume that the specific development activity in the critical area that is subject to the application for which the variance is required does not conform with the general purpose and intent of state law and the requirements of this ordinance. In other words, when you show up to ask for a variance, everybody knows you're begging because the presumption is you're asking for something that you're not entitled to. Okay, it's a very important principle. And it's not something that is universal in zoning hearings, but in this state kind of requirement, you show up with hat in hand. Second, unwarranted hardship means that without a variance, an applicant would be denied reasonable and significant use of the entire parcel or lot for which the variance is requested. So if your lot was, 1 acre in size, and it was only 300 feet deep from the water to the edge of the property line, and you couldn't do anything because of the buffer is 300 feet, you'd have a pretty good case to request a variance, right? Because it would be a hardship, without a doubt. You're entitled to use your property by law, and you show up and you say, Chris has told me that the buffer is 300 feet. I can't do anything with my property. Are you going to buy it? And the town's going to say, no, we'll go get a variance. So this is a relief valve for them. Question is legitimate. Are there instances where we have actual lots or development potential within the buffer? Because we're just staying focused on the buffer. And I really think that opportunities are really limited within the buffer itself.
So we brought this up on another occasion, and there is a such thing as a limit of variance. Is that correct or not?
Limit of variance.
Limit of variance. Okay, well, I'm not prepared to make a case for it.
Limit of disturbance?
No, it's a limit of variance. But I think we did have this conversation, and that's, I'm not prepared to talk about it. So I was just asking you the question. You're not familiar with it, so I retract my question.
Then there are certain standards that would have to be proven by the applicant. And there are standards 1 through 7, on page 40 and 41. And they're pretty tough standards.
So you were going to tell us about potential lots that would be considered.
Oh, no, I was just making the point. I don't think there are any.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
there are none, and you think,
In other words, any property that butts the water or tidal wetlands that is within the buffer is of such substantial size that it's probably reasonable that if you were doing some kind of development opportunity, you could do it outside the buffer. As a practical matter, what again is the typical situation that would occur is that someone would show up to the town and wanting to build something that is closer to the water because that's where it made sense. And we'd have to say no, and they'd have to come to ask for a variance. And of course, the variance would be denied if these standards are applied strictly. Because, well, you'd like to be close to the water, but you don't know a lot. There's nothing in this law that guarantees you waterfront views, right? In fact, the whole code is against that in terms of all these forest preservation requirements in the buffer. So,
But this, when I read the top of the page where it says unwarranted hardship on an applicant, I was trying to think, would that be financial? But then they define unwarranted hardship. That means without the applicant getting the variance, they're going to be unhappy. But it seems like it's circuitous because the definition of that means it seems like the definition is they want the variance because without it, they have an unwarranted hardship. But they're referring to the unwarranted hardship to mean that you're not going to get it. And it's like, wait a minute.
what standard are you referring to? One of the 7 standards?
On
just the-
page 40
Yes.
at the top of the page.
Yeah.
So number 2.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think that's trying to define what unwarranted hardship is stated above.
Yep.
But it doesn't, it seems like, wait a minute. I thought the unwarranted hardship would be they want the variance because, for example, it's causing them financial, ruin because they can't develop the land. But they're saying that the unwarranted hardship is because they're going to be denied.
Um,
I mean, what's the definition
No.
of reasonable, be
Yeah.
denied reasonable and significant use of an entire parcel?
Good question. All these are good questions. So it's saying that you would suffer, the board has to decide that you would suffer a hardship. Or if you could not make reasonable use of your property because of the way the ordinance was structured. So the question is, can you make reasonable use of your property or not? And still comply with the ordinance. If complying with the ordinance meant my house had to be 300 feet back from the water, but my house was only 300 feet deep, and I had no room to put my house therefore, except for within this buffer, and you're telling me I can't build a buffer, or I can't build in the buffer, then you can see that's the hardship. Like, I can't do anything. I can't make reasonable use, or certainly significant use in the entire parcel. So that's a tough standard, because for instance, let's say that your lot was 500 feet deep, but you wanted to put your house in the first 200 feet closer to the water. Naturally, you'd want to play, probably. And you show up and say, I'm suffering a hardship. I want to put my house here in the first 200 feet close to the water, and you have a 300-foot buffer. I can't do it. The Board of Appeals would say, wait a minute, your property is 500 feet deep. Why can't you move your house 400 feet from the water? You're out of the buffer and you can do what you want. You don't have to worry about these regulations. And the applicant might say, because I enjoy the water's view. I want to be close to the water. And the Board of Appeals will say, you're not suffering a hardship, because you can still make reasonable use of your property. You can still build a house. It's just not where you want it to be.
Right.
You can still put a swimming pool in. It's just, you have a longer distance to the waterfront. That is not our concern. Our concern is protecting that 300 feet buffer. And you can still make reasonable, in fact, significant use. You can build a house. So Kelly, that meant to answer your question too.
Yes.
Okay.
But the last thing,
Yeah.
we got to be candid here and clear. I'm explaining something in a very kind of matter-of-fact way, as if everybody thinks the same way and interprets things. But the Board of Appeals is not made up of people who are trained to think about this, or they're made of regular citizens who are asked to sit as judges in a quasi-judicial hearing and balance a lot of things. And it is sometimes frustrating when a board decides something because they use their own judgment that doesn't seem to comport with the intent of the zoning ordinance. But that's the way law is in zoning. And on balance, I think it's probably better, because I think the average citizen in town has better judgment about a lot of these things than I do. I can only provide the technical parts. So what I'm saying is that ultimately it's up to the person sitting in your chair is going to say, is that reasonable or not? Or is that significant or not? Clearly, if it was 300 feet and the person only had 300 feet of lot area, that's an open shut case. Clearly, there's no reasonable use anymore. There's a hardship. But the other part is and it's hard to decide. And what the board uses to decide is those standards, 1 through 7. They look at the standards and then they balance them all out and negotiate, and they come to a decision that they think is best. So even where it looks like 200 feet is a reasonable area to put a house, from the abstract, me being an abstract, it may not be when an actual board looks at it. That's why variances sometimes get approved and people are scratching their heads.
Because we all have a different interpretation of reasonable.
Right, but that's why we hold a public hearing. They're able to cross-examine witnesses, and the applicant has a job of presenting it. If people are opposed to it, they can show up and have their own attorney and their own witnesses to argue against it. The process is created, but how the end result really requires engagement on the part of residents.
Well, I think the concern I'm having here is that this particular ordinance is probably the most important thing we could be doing. And as you can see, we have taken now almost an hour or an hour and a half just going over basically 2 pages. I mean, it's really, now apparently we cannot get a staff member to come to our meeting. So it looks like that's not on the table. Next month. We were going to ask to have an area, a critical area staff
right,
member come
right,
and answer questions and maybe go over some of these ideas with us. But actually, maybe we really don't want somebody from the office, because it's really about our particular area and how sensitive our particular sites are. And if we, as a resident board commission, feels that certain areas are more sensitive, or certain areas are more sensitive than areas that they would possibly understand or know about. Maybe they don't understand our city or our town as much as we do. So going back to, let's just go back to that 300 feet or the 200 feet. I think what I would do is depend on Chris for an interpretation of what does that extra 100 feet mean from let's just say 200 to, because I really think it should at least be 200. That seems like we have enough environmentally sensitive areas here to warrant the 200, especially when you have some sea level rise, whatnot. But, going from 2 to 3, now we're talking, we could be encroaching on, private property or whatever. We could be dealing with more complicated issues down the road that would require more variances. So, when I go back to, let's just go back from the variance down, now that we understand what the variances are, we go back to page 17 and 18. And if we come to some, because we are now to 835 and we're just basically on A and B, we haven't even gotten very far on this buffer. We haven't even gotten to the modified buffer yet. So we haven't really gotten, and we haven't even gotten in fee in lieu of buffer mitigation, which to me is one of my issues. But where do we want to take this, Chris? How picky should we be getting on these? Because it looks like we're getting very picky here.
Yeah, that's okay. What I'd like to suggest is that it's okay. I will ask the Critical Area Commission, explain to them that the town's planning commission is interested in widening the regulated buffer, perhaps up to 300 feet. And I've been asked to think about what purpose that serves, or what the benefit of that is relative to the purpose of the code, and that means I'll get those stats showing the environmental benefits of buffers. But what I want to hear from them is there any issue with respect to the state's Critical Area Commission for a municipality increasing it greater, 3 times, up to 3 times its current? I don't think there is, but I will answer that question, get that question.
That's important,
And
obviously.
then explore the whole issue about interfamily transfers and all that, and say we're proposing just eliminating that whole section number 2, A and B. And if we do that, then this whole section gets written, basically says the buffer is the buffer. It's 300 feet,
Right.
Right. Or it could be expanded based on these other environmental features. Because in item 3 on page 18, the buffer can be expanded even further. Presumably, it could be expanded beyond 200 feet, which is the standard. Because if you have steep slopes or there are tidal wetlands and these other issues, it could presumably be, but that's really a case-by-case environmental assessment that's done. Good stuff, it should be in there. But making the new standard something other than 100 feet is what we'd like to do, and we want their impact or input on that particular question.
Chris, do we know if for 3D2, do we know if there's any hydraulic soils or highly erodible soils in our area that would increase our buffer to 300 feet? No, I'm putting you on the spot there, sorry.
My instincts tell me yes, without even looking at it, that's the case. Because A lot of our buffers are kind of it's a zone of transition between open water, tidal wetlands, and then hydric or wet soils before you get to upland. So there is that zone. So it's reasonable to expect it. Whether it's to such a degree that it will cause an increase above, up to 300 feet, I just don't know the answer to that. But there's certainly hydric soils all around the faces between the upland part of the buffer and the natural areas. Meaning wet soils.
I mean, the whole purpose of a buffer, if I understand correctly, is so that the runoff has a chance to be absorbed and filtered prior to it gets into the tidal basin.
That's the first purpose. Second purpose is that there be areas for wildlife to travel along the water, this habitat. So the dual purposes are habitat protection and water quality. But you're right. Yep.
So, and the reason I'm asking this is if you fly over to Dominican Republic or Haiti and you're over the island, you can clearly see the difference in the DR versus Haiti because Haiti has eliminated all of their trees and their runoff runs down the island and there's nothing to buffer it, stop it, and it goes right into the ocean and you can see it for miles out and trash and everything else.
I think, I think the second point that you made about wildlife nesting areas and protective areas, I think that is why I want to see at least 200, if not more, feet, is that I don't think 100 feet is enough space in an urban area, this somewhat urban area. And we're losing nesting sites. We're losing all the what was that?
The birds.
We're losing birds. We're losing everything that goes along with the birds. And I know that the federal government is coming down here and talking with the Chestnut Trust, Land Trust people and trying to establish more bird nesting sites all up and down the coastline here. So if they're doing that, there's obviously a problem and we need to be addressing that seriously here in our meeting. And we can help that by enlarging this buffer zone right there. So I think at least it has to be 200. Whether it goes higher than that, I think we have to insist on making sure that we can justify, and I think we can justify
I think
at least 200 to 300. So I think we have to really be, that's really important point for us right there. If we can get that much accomplished tonight, I feel pretty good because that's a lot to accomplish. And then there's so much more yet that we haven't even gotten into. But what else does anybody have about A or B development activities in the buffer? And do we have time to get on to C, buffer establishment? Does anybody have any more questions or
I have
issues?
one more question.
Yes.
Variance language, was that drafted by the state or was that's the state drafted?
That's the state
Language.
standards for buffer, for variances. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Chris, do you think we have time to go over C? Is there much, let's see, that we need to? I guess what's going to happen is you're going to take some of this back, get some questions answered. Are you going to be able to email us answers or how are we going to
Yeah.
get? Because you're not
that'd be a
gonna-
great thing. I'll email the answers.
Okay.
to you.
Okay.
I've communicated with Michael Grassman, who's our representative now. He's unable to attend meetings in the evening, at least through the foreseeable future. But he asked that we submit any questions to him and he will provide written responses. When he does, I'll just forward them to you and I'll cut it, paste it in a memo or to send an email to you.
Can you ask him what the max appropriate might be for a buffer in our town based on our comprehensive plan and what we are using our buffers for?
I mean, I like his answer though.
They
Do we want
might
to ask
not,
him?
but, I mean, they have
I
to
know.
approve it anyways, so.
99 feet.
Okay, so let's quickly go to C. Because if we don't get a little farther, this is going to take us all year if we don't watch out. Buffer establishment. Chris, can you summarize some of this or?
Sure. So basically, this says if you do some type of, if you're permitted to do some development activity or some kind of disturbance in the buffer, you have to meet certain requirements. So again, the basic onus is that buffer's off limits. However, there are exceptions, and if you get exceptions and you're able to do something, you have to comply with these types of standards. So if we go to maybe just go to the end of 19. For the buffer management plan language.
It's on 22. F?
Oh, I've gone, yeah, okay. Well, let's go to, on page 20, before we get there. Number 4. Okay, so let's say that the buffer that exists there now, and when I say buffer, I'm just meaning the theoretical 100 feet, because that's what we're looking at now, 100 or 200 feet, is actually cleared already. Say it's just spotty, a few trees, and you're coming in for development approval. As a condition of your approval, the town shall require an applicant to establish the buffer in vegetation in accordance with the table below and Part E of this chapter, and to provide buffer management plan under Part F. In other words, you kind of got to plant the buffer. If you're going to build there, you got to reestablish. You got to kind of make it natural again. You can't just sort of pull up and decide to build a house right next to the water. If it's a dedicated, protected buffer, you've got to kind of make it function like it was intended to do, or like it used to do before it was cleared. And you would have to do that for subdivision if you want to convert one land use to another, or development on a lot that was created since 2010. When a buffer is not fully forested or is not fully established in existing naturally occurring woody or wetland vegetation, an applicant shall establish the buffer to the extent required in the following table. So this table provides some documentation. So again, theoretically, if the town wanted to build that education center within the buffer and got approval to do it, and part of that area was already cleared, or I don't think that's the case, but let's assume it was, say we'll call that development on a vacant lot. You'd have to establish the buffer based on total square footage of lot coverage outside the buffer. And then you'd fully lot created after, if the lot is created before 1985, by the way, the program date, then you simply establish the buffer based on the total square footage of the lot coverage outside the buffer. So whatever impervious surface area you're building outside of the buffer, you take that square footage and you plant it in the buffer. But if it's created after, if the lot was created more recently, since 1985, you'd have to fully establish the buffer, meaning you'd have to plant that buffer. You do a buffer management plan. We review them from time to time in town. I'll tell you a little bit more about that when the time's right. But we review these plans, and they call for a wide selection of native plants and trees, and they have to be planted according to an arborist direction. And that is all kind of drawn from the critical area regs. If, for instance, there was a subdivision, and again, we're not going to have a subdivision in town, but in a buffer, but theoretically, you'd have to fully establish that buffer. If that buffer was 300 feet and right now it was cleared, it would become a forest as a condition for building. That would mean, for instance, that I know it's self-evident. New lot with an existing dwelling unit. So you establish the buffer based on total square footage. So conversion of a land use on a parcel or a lot to another land use, you fully establish the buffer. So these are the the direction, the regulations on that.
The center one is the lot created before, is that prior to 1985? And then the lot created after is after 1985?
Yes, our local program date is, I don't know
Okay.
the date precise, but it's 1985, 86, something like that.
Is conversion of land use on a parcel essentially redevelopment?
It could be redevelopment, but it's really changing the, it doesn't have to be redeveloped, it doesn't have to be development activity, and it could be converting an old junkyard that was down by the swamp, converting that into a car repair facility. You're kind of changing the use. Basically, the code says we don't want that stuff there anyway, but if it's there, now's the time, as a condition of our approval, we're going to require you to plant the buffer.
So if we have a lot, I mean, a lot of our lots are essentially, our vacant lots are essentially paved right now.
Not in the buffer.
Not, right, they're in the modified buffer. Okay,
Yeah, that's a
Gotcha.
good thing. Another, for people at home, what we're talking about is just the naturalized
Oh.
buffer, the areas that are forested and wetlands and the green space around the town's waterways. We're not talking about the bay front or Fishing Creek marina area. So, I mean, that really is C. It really assumes that a town allows development in the buffer, in which case the degree to which you have to plant the buffer if you're going to build within that area. Again, I don't know that a lot of this is required if the answer to our approach is the 300-foot buffer is sacrosanct. The only way you can do it is variance or some of these like shoreline type of things. We might simply say, provide mitigation to plant the buffer, to mitigate for what you have removed. If you have to remove 2,000 square feet of trees and put down a building in the buffer, you've got to find a way to plant that. The reality is our buffer is already forested, so I don't know where you plant that, so you have to do something other than that, perhaps that fee in lieu or other best management practices on the parcel. Again, this is all, the way it's drafted is premised on the idea that a town is going to be growing into its natural areas and allowing them to be developed. And it's not the way the town's set up at all. In fact, you didn't establish a growth area that encompassed natural areas. Maybe a question to ask is, what do other jurisdictions do when it's clear that they don't need these provisions? Do they just remove them, and then in the event they ever do, then they update the code? Or they just keep them in as sort of extra language that adds some heft to the code? That's what they are now
I'd
in
be
the current
interested in
code.
the answer to that question.
Huh?
I said I'd be interested
Yeah.
in the answer to that question because they are providing a valve for somebody to maybe do something, whereas if we don't need to have them,
Yeah, if
that
we don't,
valve, then,
why provide that
right.
valve? And if there ever is a public purpose for it, then we can go to the model ordinance and the critical area commission, take them
Amend.
out.
That's my thought process.
How many properties would you say this would affect?
I don't know exactly, but I think it's only a handful. I think it's only
Should we
7.
ask that you look that up?
Yeah.
I think we should actually get specific on that.
I'll show you the map that shows the buffer. I'll show you the map that shows the buffer exempt area, and everything that's not that is the buffer. It's within the town. But I'll show you that. As it turns out, a lot of our buffer is owned by Calvert County and Chesapeake Beach.
And if we went to the 200 or 300, would it be the same, or would we be impacting more properties that are private?
It's a good question, so I'll look into it.
All right. So that answer you could also email to us, perhaps?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So any more questions about the buffer establishment? Seems like I think you gave us a pretty good response to anybody else have anything about? Okay. I don't think we have time for D, because D could get a little bit involved. What are your thoughts, Chris, on D? Mitigation for impacts of the buffer.
No, I kind of think it's straightforward, but I'd be interested in your thoughts. But if you think it's going to take a while, then we could avoid it. But
well, I mean, I get down to the removal of trees, and I get a little, I start questioning things about, well, is that what kind of mitigation are you talking about here? And is what's really dead? And, you know, I've seen people go out and kill things just to get rid of them. And yeah, I mean,
well, this sort of, let me just throw this out. The way that we deal with the buffer most frequently is someone there's a tree that's removed in a natural area. It might be part of the Richfield Station open space. Someone goes there and cuts down a tree. To find the owner. HOA. The HOA then finds the person that lives closest to that maybe said, the tree's distance is in my view shed. It happens. So then we find the owner and we go out and we require them to plant it. We first require them to submit a buffer management plan, which shows the canopy of the trees that were removed and replace it on a 4-to-1. So if they take one tree down, 4, or if we figure out that those trees covered 2,000 square feet, we multiply that times 4. You've got to plant trees that grow up to cover 8,000 square feet. I mean, that gets pretty strident. So we did that recently. There was just think of private property. There's a private property on the hillside closest to Cox Road. So if you were on Cox Road, you could go to a house, and if you went behind the house, there's a steep forested hillside that goes down to the marsh and the water, Moffett Lake, I think we call it. Yeah, someone decided to clear the forest, and someone noticed, and we enforced that. Not a lot, maybe 20 trees or something like that, but they had a really hefty price to pay in terms of replanting. They had a lot of trees, a lot of understory trees, these native shrubs. They really did it was a big heft. And I'm certain they regretted doing it because it was pretty strident. Because the critical area is concerned about these. The town is concerned. The town really it takes no prisoners when it comes to removal of trees in those areas.
You say the town takes no prisoners in that, but this is, how does this happen that somebody is able to do that? And I realize not everybody can be everywhere, but, it seems to me we are constantly in this, oh, now we're going to slap your hand, but the trees are gone. And I don't know how that is permitted to occur. We're acting in the rears. After it does, then we're outraged, but it's like they're gone. Beautiful trees.
Well, it's not just beautiful. They were homes to birds and animals, and the little new saplings are not going to be the same homes that the mature trees were, and you can't really replace it 4-to-1. That doesn't make any sense. And that's where I think we fall down, is we don't slap on huge fines that really make it hurt.
Right. That nobody would even
Replacing 4-to-1
consider.
doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
Right.
It was
trees?
That wasn't a critical area buffer issue, or a critical area issue, actually. It was an issue, but
Cleared it.
I don't know what the fine was, but there was tree removal on a steep slope, and there were provisions in the steep slope ordinance we talked about that came into place, required him to replant that entire thing and paid fines.
But it should be so prohibitive that somebody couldn't even step foot on a piece of land, whether they're going to build a house, whether they're redeveloping, with any thought about touching these trees on that it's just known. You just can't cut a blade of grass. And, I mean, it just makes me heartsick when I still, drive by the property that they took that 100-year-old tree down, and that landscaper had no more knowledge. I mean, the fact that they were transporting 10 bags of mulch in their Beamer to the property was like, this is so fly by night. But, it's a critical area, and that just happened. And, I want to see it that anybody who's going to think about doing anything like this won't give it that thought. It should be so prohibitive that I can't just go to the bank and, okay, write a check. No, this
Well,
is...
And the tree ordinance that's been proposed, when you compare it to other tree ordinances in places, it is very, very light on everything as far as measuring. It's light on fines. It's light on requiring an arborist for certain things. It allows the owner to decide if a tree is diseased or not I don't know what the process would be to prove the owner wrong. So that needs to be looked at again if our town's going to implement it, because it removes so many protections. It gives a fine for per tree when in some places the fine is per inch of the diameter of the tree. It needs to be looked at very closely and compared with other tree ordinances.
I think part of the
It's not
issue
even
is
close.
failure to communicate with our residents what's in the regulation and what's allowable and what's not allowable. Because I think if they knew it wasn't allowable and they would be fined, they wouldn't do it. But if they're not aware of the regulations and the requirements,
Well, it's kind of like, ask forgiveness, not permission. And that's how people proceed. But right, whether it's a one-page handout that says, when you're going to build or redevelop, make sure you're aware of that. But I agree with Lori. I mean, if other jurisdictions have it per inch, it makes me
Yeah,
crazy.
and we're preserving trees that I bought visual aids.
Okay, so let's get back to
I'll give them to you,
the
Kathleen.
business at hand. We are pretty much at D, page 21. I think we kind of have covered page 20, where D, in mitigation for impacts to the buffer. I think we may have more concerns about that, changing that. So I think we're going to talk about next month. But I think we need to stop at D and begin at D for those of you who really want to get this down and start reading. And then if you can see, we get to, there's even other habitat protection areas on page 26. The FIDS is talked about there. We get into a lot of really detailed issues here. So we need to keep moving, but I think now it's 9 o'clock. I think we should stop at D. And just wait for Chris to bring some of these answers back to us by email. One last comment from everybody about what we've done tonight, which, of course, we've had so many issues and questions. We haven't gotten very far, but is there anything more that, Chris, you want to talk to us about with concern to A, B, C,
A, B, and C actually is all we've really gotten to. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, we don't.
Okay, and what about all of you up here? Lori, anything more for A, B, and C tonight?
No, I think Chris is going to get us some answers and clarification.
Everybody
I think
have
that's good.
anything else they want to add? Okay, so A, B, and C, we want to really make sure we know what we're doing on those particular areas. And so we will then move on. To number, I'm going to call it 6B, I guess, which is the next thing on our agenda for Chris to talk about the agenda item for next month. He has a little bit of an introduction to this item. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is, as yet hypothetical, just to give you a heads up. It may or may not come to you, but it very well may. Years ago, when Horizons on the Bay was constructed, it was built to in a zone that allowed, it was called commercial high density, allowed both commercial and high density housing projects, obviously. And it allowed for a mix of uses within the same building. Okay. So I don't know if anyone's been in the building, but you might realize or have seen that there is some commercial, some kind of office spaces like that. Well, when the zoning amendments were passed, it made those types of uses no longer legal. They could be non-conforming, in other words, grandfathered, except that to maintain your non-conforming status, you have to have been vacant for a year, and so they were already vacant. For over a year, so they're no longer viable uses. So the town has recently received an application for a salon and to go in the building, and the building owner wants it, and we've had to say you can't use that building for commercial uses any longer by virtue of the zoning ordinance changes. So the applicant is going to be petitioning for a zoning change, and I believe I will likely be drafting a zoning text amendment that the mayor will introduce, or someone in town council, or at least will consider introducing it. And then that would come to the planning commission at your next meeting for a recommendation, because every zoning text amendment requires a recommendation from the planning commission. Whether that starts with you or starts with the mayor and council, it all has to come through you for a recommendation, whether it's positive or negative, or you could suggest anything. But the town council is required to submit something before they adopt it. And so what types of uses would presumably be allowed in a building like that? Probably the ones that had existed there previously. A limited amount of like office related uses, salon, physical therapy, those types of uses that would fit in that space. They still have to make sure they have the parking and all that. And of course, they're very conscious of what they would allow, because they have owners in that building. It's a condominium. It's not as if it's just an apartment complex. So in any case, this is kind of a legislative fix to allow a building that was built for some commercial, ground floor commercial, to continue that use. And I don't know how you will actually come down in terms of a recommendation, but ultimately you'll see some kind of draft if they decide to move forward with it. And I just want to give you a heads up on that. And I don't have any more like data or information on it other than that, but I just want to give you a heads up.
If I remember correctly, didn't there used to be a hair salon in there?
I believe that was the case, and physical therapy.
Isn't there still a physical therapy in there now?
They moved across the street.
Well, Pivot moved across the street, but then I thought there was another one that moved back in.
There's a sign that
There's a
says
sign.
it, but it doesn't exist anymore. I had a conversation with the building manager and discussed that. So right now doesn't exist. The sign exists still. I noticed because I was just there tonight just to check it out.
Getting a haircut? No kidding.
Well, signs like that should come down when they're no longer appropriate for the situation, code enforcement should probably have those removed.
Yeah.
Well, that's clutter, sign clutter. You know, that's what we need to be looking at, or things like
This
that.
particular sign I'm referring to is a small sign, like 2 by 2 feet near the front door of the building. So it's not visible from.
Pivot sign is
No.
outside on the corner.
No, not the pivot. Oh, I wasn't referring
Oh,
to that. I
okay.
was referring to a small kind
Oh.
of little kind of sign that they've kept in the landscaping bed as you walk into the front door.
Oh, yeah, I'm talking
I was talking
about
about the pivot.
outside of the
Okay.
gate, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I have seen that sign. yes.
Yeah. But you know, it's misleading and we need to
Okay, we'll,
unnecessary sign clutter.
we'll address that.
Yeah.
As a part of this, I mean, since they're all related, it's the same owner.
Well, that's a good point. It should be part of this permit process. Okay, so the reason why he's bringing this up is that Chris won't be here next month at the meeting. So if we go ahead with the meeting, we will probably have that item, and I wanted him to give you an introduction so that since he won't be here, he can give it to you now.
And if it did come to you, it would come with a staff report, and even potentially someone from the town staff would be here to present the proposal to. for you.
Somebody would be able
I
to.
can't guarantee that, but I'm imagining that would be a reasonable approach if I wasn't able to be here. Well, I suspect the owner would want to attend, sure, but I don't know for certain. I don't know.
Okay, let's go to number 7, which is comments by commissioners. So let's start with, who wants to start? Would you like to start? Do you have a comment?
No, one thing that I would like to talk about the size of the buffer, and I don't think we should all apologetic for a buffer. It's hey. I also think that it goes to have to know about it. If somebody comes in for a building permit, they should sign something about this big. They understand.
They've read it.
Oh, yeah, you have to do that. Because otherwise, we can get mad all day long, but if if they haven't studied the code or
We don't know it.
right. So there has to be a big effort to do that. And I think it's well worthwhile.
Well, PR, we have to have some public relations when we put this through. That's a good idea. Kelly, what would you like to report tonight?
Agree with Jan. I think we may need to do a PR blitz on tree removal. Maybe an email on the website or something.
Well, we'll talk about that when we talk about the tree issue. It's going to come down the road here, but that's perfect. Kathleen, what do you?
I just wanted to mention 2 things. At the town council work session, I just wanted to recognize Chris. Obviously, the town council members had, several questions about the compatibility standards, and I think he represented it really well. They kept trying to drive the point home to Chris. Well, I mean, these seem strict, it seems impactful to development, and Chris was very clear and said, matter of factly, no, these are not stringent. There's a lot more stringent standards in other jurisdictions, and this isn't over the top. And I think some of the council members were trying to get that point in, and he didn't allow it. So, I thank him. He talked about our commission doing great work and giving it great time and attention. So I just wanted to recognize Chris for that. And my only other comment was they were out today on the beach. They try to rid from the green team, the Japanese knotweed, which is, I'm telling you, if they don't eradicate it, you're going to wake up one morning and not be able to open your door because it is like rampant, its growth. And it's going all the way down, the bay from Brownies Beach all the way down. It's just wild, but they are addressing it with the help of the green team, and they're using a very, environmentally friendly solution too that will not harm the bay. And so I just noted those two things.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll second what Kathleen said. I watched the meeting and I did appreciate Chris standing behind what the recommendations were. And now we need the town council to pass the code. I'm guessing that we don't have a site plan that was turned in on Monday, May 8th, but we need that code. If you take all these little steps for reversible things in the right direction, but you take big, large, costly, permanent steps in the wrong direction, you're going to end up in the wrong place. And we need that code from the town council.
We're assuming that's going to be next month or no? The compatibility townhome multifamily,
If the council would take it up next month? I don't know.
not sure.
He was going to provide some text about a more objective comment, statement.
Yeah, the only thing that I actually reflecting on that the other day, and the only thing I actually volunteered and said I would do that was to clarify a statement. There was a Councilwoman Hartman raised a specific comment about, oh goodness, one standard I think we've talked about quite a bit here. It was just to narrow down what the meaning was. And I forgot the term right now, but
Yeah.
but the broader sort of describing all the terms going through, no, it's just only that discrete one question when that.
Yeah,
one
it was saying, was it the building standard or high quality standard?
high quality. Yeah. What's it really mean? What are we after? And
Right.
my point is, well, let's relate that to the purposes of the
Yeah.
code rather than leaving it out there because it suggests something that you're not, it wasn't your concern. One quality versus the other. It was about how well it.
Yeah, I
does its
think you
job.
said commensurate with comparable projects in the area. Those, as far as what those standards, what indicated a high quality standard. And I think you said using, similar materials of,
Yeah.
neighboring structures.
I just have one comment, and that is basically it goes along with what Kathleen was talking about, trying to mitigate. We've got groundhogs along the B Street cliff that have been burrowing and tunneling for years. And when I lived in California, we have groundhogs in California. And they're smaller, but they tunnel and they can bring, and I've seen them bring down entire hillsides with the houses on them. And it's just from tunneling. You get the tunnels and you get a little bit of water encroachment. That's all that's all you need to have that whole hillside come down. And the interesting thing is when we were walking over there, they're literally standing on top of these cages that they're trying to, they were waving to us
Eating
with
an
signs.
apple.
We love the cage. It provides us a little, my husband and I just laughed because those guys are smart and they know that that's a cage to trap them in there and they're not going to do it. But I don't know what other mitigation resource we have there, but it's not, I don't think it's working.
But, I just want to say, I was of the same opinion because I was thinking the hillside, if it's like Swiss cheese, it's got to be weakened. And I spoke to a neighboring geologist and he said, those groundhogs will not bring the hill down. He said that whether they can burrow or not, it doesn't weaken the hill. And I thought this is kind of like the cars that now the new cars, when you stop, the car shuts down. And I was like, when I grew up, it was like, no, you'll wear out the starter. But now this is totally new. But he's saying not because, the ground, there was one trapped the other day. And I have to say, I was like, I'm going to let him out. I just felt bad because I'm out. I couldn't, but I felt bad.
some other
That's
place.
right, that's
To the
right.
big
That's
round
right.
ball
Because
station.
sadly, I'm of the opinion.
No, I want them to go in the sky. I feel bad for
Because if
them.
nothing else, they're eating the foliage too, that is protecting.
Kudzu
the hillside.
away, I
Well,
say.
I know there's a lot of kudzu, but there's more than just kudzu too.
Is there something to plant that would deter them, kind of like the deers?
No,
Nothing.
That's the problem. is that I'm not an exterminator, but I do know that in California, the gophers did destroy hillsides because we don't get any water. It wasn't really the water so much as it was the tunneling. So I don't know.
Defies-
That's,
The geologist.
Yeah, it
said
doesn't make
defies
any- but
logic
anyway.
to me.
Because I went and got him and said, look at him. And he's like, oh my God. And then he said to me, I'm like, they are destroying the hillside. And he said, it absolutely not. There's no scientific basis that they will weaken that hill. So I was like, are you sure? Because I'll go let out Fred because I feel bad for him.
so, so if they continue, it'll probably, and they go down to the Navy area, then the Navy will probably bring in the APHIS sharpshooters like they did with the deer to take care of them.
you do that.
I'm pulling myself.
I
out
hear
of
them.
it.
I hear them all the time shooting the deer. Anyway, that's one other issue. Any other issues before we close out the meeting? Do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, and I adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much. It's been lovely.
I know that I have the groundhog. He's like, he sits on the pilot in my backyard, like eating an apple. Like, what else you got in there? I know that.